would like to welcome you to the Quark and Roll podcast. My name is Kwok Pui Lan. Today, I'm going to talk with Dr. Clifton Clarke about race and Black history and the global growth of Pentecostalism, as well as being a global leader. Dr. Clarke, you have recently published the book, Dear Professor, Real Talk on Race, Black History, and Identity. Can you tell us why you wrote it and what is it about?
Thank you for having me on this wonderful podcast. Just to jump in, this book really came out of, and it's really rooted in my own story, a Black British boy in England trying to survive empire. I was born and raised in the UK in the 1970s and 1980s. And that was really an era that was thick with the aftershock, really, of the British colonial rule and the unraveling of empire. And I came to age at the Thatcher era, and the issues of police brutality coded in nationalism and the denial of Black British identity were all visible yet erased present realities that many of us face. And so this book really came about when I was professor in Ghana. I was living in Ghana for 10 years, and I was a professor there at the Pan-African University. And a student of mine that when I was teaching in the US, I went there for a few sort of teaching opportunities and lectures. And I was doing a book launch, and he wrote to me, and he began to share with me some of the struggles he was having as a Black youth living and raised and growing up in the United States. And the book came about because he wrote to me and said that he bought my book. And so he wrote to me, I wrote back. So he would write with questions and struggles of issues of history and identity and the issues of Black pain and struggle and happiness and music. And each time I would write back, giving some theological, historical significance and meaning. So it was a conversation between his questions and my responses. And I thought this would be a wonderful opportunity for a book. So I got the information that we had, put it together, edited it, and made it into a form of a book called Dear Professor. I thought this was a good time to reclaim and to reestablish the importance of Black history during this time when Black history is being erased. And this book is not a highly academic book. It's really written for high school students and for college students and people who want to reclaim and celebrate the significance of the Black presence in the United States and also Black history around the world.
What are the challenges of talking about race and Black history at a time when the Trump administration is against DJI programs and even critical race theory?
Wow, what a question. For me, I would say that there are challenges because what we are seeing and witnessing is what I would call a theological suppression of truth. The rejection of CRT and even DEI program deflect a spiritual resistance to truth and truth-telling. We're reminded, for example, that James H. Cone reminds us that any message that is not related to the liberation of the poor in society is not the message of Christ. And so this idea that we are not utilizing our resources to support and to celebrate and to uplift those who are the most vulnerable in our society is deeply troubling. And I think also we're witnessing what I would call historical amnesia and also the importance of sacred memory. I'm from the Black tradition and a movement that celebrates memory is all. And so it's important for us to keep memories alive. And I think that in Toni Morrison, she warns that the function of racism is distraction, and it keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. And that's because often the memory is obscured and objurgated. In the Black prophetic tradition, remembering is an act of resistance. We are the dream and the hope of the slave, as Maya Angelou declares. People who remember, when remembrance is about defiance, and also it's a challenge of erasure. And what we are really seeing also is the criminalization of what I would call the intellectual freedom, the labeling of CRT as dangerous, weaponized education reminds me of what Bell Hooks actually wrote, that the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. And all of this anti-CRT rhetoric criminalizes Black pedagogy and the theological inquiry, especially when it's rooted in the liberative tradition. And so there's a number of troubling issues, such as when I think about colorblindness and identity as a theological malpractice, this idea that the myth of colorblindness in a theological era. And I think, as Dr. Jennings reminds us, that race as a way of perceiving and organizing our lives is a Christian invention and gone mad, if you like. And to ignore race is to ignore the spiritual damage that colonial Christianity has done and continues to do, and in the name of neutrality. And so this idea that we erase this idea of injury, of the original sin of America, is deeply troubling. It's what I would call epistemic violence, erasure of Black knowledge. Rejecting CRT is not neutral, it's violent. As Crenshaw tells us, that denying the existence of systematic racism is a dangerous reality. And so I would say that it really contradicts the gospel. And we can discuss the particularities and the perspectives, but this idea that it is really attacking something sacred within our Christian tradition, within our biblical tradition, that talks about the importance of the other, the importance of the weak, the importance of the down and out, the importance of the least of these. And so for me, it's deeply troubling. And I think we really need the prophetic rhetoric to speak out against this and to continue to work to uplift society and the most vulnerable among us.
Dr. Clarke, as you know that, I work in post-colonial theology. I couldn't agree with you more that we need to look at the legacy of colonial Christianity and challenge white supremacy.
Yes.
I also like Bell Hooks. I learned so much from her, especially teaching to transgress. You have also recently released a book, We Were There, Black Presence in the Bible and Early Christianity. Can you give us a few examples of Black presence in the Bible?
Yes, I'm a pastor now. I served as a professor at Regent University. I've been teaching in Pan-African universities in Ghana. I've taught in Nigeria. I taught in Kenya. And of course, I was a dean at Fuller Theological Studies for Black Church Studies. And so I've been a part of the academy. But more and more, I'm feeling the need to write in a way that engages the church and also the laity. And this was something that many people were asking me, that Christianity was perceived by many as a white man's religion, a religion that is promoting white supremacy. And I couldn't disagree more. So that gave the birth to this book, that when we're thinking about Christianity and thinking about the Bible, it's deeply a book that celebrates diversity and culture, and African influence is embedded in it. And just picking up a few things here, one of the chapters that I like is the daughters of Cush, Candike, and the warrior queens, and particularly Queen Candike, or Candike in the Latinized version. Read about the Ethiopian eunuch and the idea that Ethiopia was a massive empire. Ethiopia has a rich Christian heritage. And I could talk all day about that. But what I like about Queen Candike is the warrior queen. And history tells us how when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, and he was going on to conquer Ethiopia, he was faced by this ferocious queen warrior with an army of gigantic elephants. And this defiant Black female leader coming up against the formidable Alexander the Great. And it was even reported that she met with him and she said that if you try to conquer Ethiopia, I'm going to chop off your head and roll it down the hill. Clearly, he went on to other places. And even to this day, Ethiopia has never been colonized. And so this idea of this Black warrior queen speaks to the sisters in the wilderness. It speaks to Black feminists like Patricia Collins and Dolores Williams, and you can go on, these warrior queens in the theological academy. Also, there's a section here that celebrates Nimrod. Now, most people in the Bible talk about Nimrod as the one who disobeyed God and tried to erect the Tower of Babel. But people don't recognize that after the flood, Nimrod was a city builder. Nimrod, who was the grandson of Noah and the son of Cush, he was the one that built cities. He was the one that when you think about Nineveh, Babel, Akkad, and many of these civilizations in a place at the time that was called Shinar, where the Sumerians were, this was the earliest civilization. And we see a man called Nimrod, who is one of the first architects, city builders, and is a place of tremendous pride to know that one of the first individual that really built cities and some of the great nations around the early history was someone of African descent. It gives me great joy. And I think really there are many, but I also like this, the idea which Thomas Oden talks about African Christianity and also the African memory of Mark. Many biblical scholars overlook the fact that Mark himself was a person of African descent. And time wouldn't allow me really to talk about his contribution to today what we call Libya. And back then it was called Cyrene, and how he played a tremendous role. And what Thomas Oden tells us is that it was Mark's mother who was the one who had the large house, the upper room that we read in the Bible, was actually, many scholars tell us, including Thomas Oden, that it was actually in Mark's mother's house. So the day of Pentecost took place in the home of a Black woman. That makes a lot of sense to me. When I say the day of Pentecost, I'm talking about the upper room experience took place in the home of Mark's mother. They were wealthy people that moved from Cyrene to Palestine to Israel. And it goes on and on. Simon of Cyrene and many of the Black queens and personalities in the Old Testament. The Bible is rich with Black history. The Bible is rich and that celebrate Black female, Black people of African descent. And other people are there too. But I want to make it very clear that we were there.
Thank you very much for writing this book, because it is accessible to the general public. And thank you for lifting up the Black presence, especially the strong Black women in the Bible. I will never forget, next time when I read the Pentecost story, it is in a Black woman's home that particular event took place. Dr. Clarke, you are a leader in the Pentecostal tradition, and I know that the third Pan-African Pentecostal conference is going to be held this June in Zambia. Can you share with us some of the highlights of this conference?
Yeah, first of all, let me just tell you about this exciting new organization called the Alliance for Black Pentecostal Scholarship. It's bpscholars.com. The Alliance for Black Pentecostal Scholarship was born when we visited James Cone's funeral. And I was thinking about what is the next generation for Black theology. And a few of us got together and we were discussing and lamenting partly that the funeral of James Cone seems to be bifurcated from the church. It wasn't a church celebration. It was pretty much the celebration of a scholar, but not necessarily of a church leader. That may be an exaggeration, but that was our perception. That what we were seeing was a bifurcation of the church and the academy within the Black tradition. And what we realized is that we thought about the importance of Black Pentecostalism, which is a global phenomenon. When you're thinking about Pentecostalism in general, it's some of the most richest dynamic growth of Christianity around the world is seen in the Pentecostal space, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in America, whether it's in Africa. What we are seeing is a dynamic burgeoning of a tradition that is a pneumatological and highly Pentecostal. And Harvey Cox talks about this in his book, Fire from Heaven. He's the same guy that wrote the book that talked about postmodernism and the sort of the end of Christianity, so to speak, coming back to see that Pentecostalism was something that he didn't anticipate. But the point I'm making here is that we decided that in Africa, in many parts of the Black diasporic world and the Black transatlantic, Black Pentecostal preaching tradition, gospel music, prophetic tradition, all the rest of it was there. But we were concerned that the theological tradition was not keeping pace with the spiritual exuberance. And we felt that just like many other traditions, whether it's Protestants, Catholic, whether it's Reformed, Calvinist, whenever you have a church movement, a movement of the Spirit, it's important to have a theological tradition to keep it in check and to keep the dialogue in place. And thus was born the Alliance of Black Pentecostal Scholarship. And it's the first space in the world, really. And in addition to that, many students from around the world were contacting me saying that they are studying sort of African Pentecostalism, Caribbean Pentecostalism, or Black Pentecostalism in its diasporic forms. And there was little space to discuss it. Many times, even within the Pentecostal tradition, Black Pentecostalism is a kind of a subcategory that is not given much attention. So what we decided to do was to start this movement, and it's a fantastic movement. And the goal of this movement is to ensure that the Black Pentecostal tradition also has a robust theological and academic tradition alongside it. And it fell to us to do this. And so we started this movement. And at our first conference with Trinity Theological Seminary in Ghana, great success, about 250 people came, and we had people from the Caribbean, people from Brazil, people from Africa, people from Black America, from Europe, all came together to talk about the world through the lens of Black Pentecostal tradition. So whether it was climate change, what is a Black Pentecostal take on climate change, the issues of gender and sexuality, issues of social justice. We felt that because of the growth of Black Pentecostalism, we need to be engaging these things without leaving our tradition and entering into white evangelical epistemology or tradition to answer questions that we have not had time to address. And so we are creating this. And so in June, we're having our third Black Pan-African Pentecostal Conference in Zambia. We have people coming from all over the world, Black and white, and everybody in between. And the topic is the Spirit in the world. And so we're excited about that. And surely if you are interested in that, let me know. But wonderful opportunity, and I'm looking forward to this great conference.
I wish you all the best and great success for the conference. I want to ask you, all over the world, the Pentecostal tradition has been growing. Is it also growing among Black people in the United States?
Yes, in the 60s and the 70s, people felt that postmodernism and post-structuralism, and many of these postmodern scholars who talked about not just the death of God and talked about how Christianity will no longer have a pneumatological supernatural essence. With the growth of science and technology, it's seen as a sign of backwardness to talk about demons and angels and so on and so forth. And so the move to more of a rational and intellectual and formal discourse about Christianity was a sign of the future orientation. But what people like Harvey Cox and many others have realized is that the pneumatic, the noumenon, the spiritual, it's something that is deeply embedded in us, and that dreams, visions, and the supernatural is not something that postmodernism can easily sweep away. And so what people did not realize was that there is a deep need to feel to experience transcendence, to experience a God who's bigger than us, to be caught up in his presence. And so Pentecostalism had a tradition that imbibed that, really. When you're thinking about particularly people like William J. Seymour and the Azusa Street Revival. And it wasn't just the Azusa Street Revival. There were other revivals around the world that were Pentecostal and Pentecostalized, chiefly also in Africa. We had many people like William Wadi Harris, Samson Sapong, Simon Kimbango around the world who had in the early 20s a pneumatic take on Christianity in a post-colonial, postmodern era. Now, what I want to share is that Pentecostalism bides this and it celebrates it. And it doesn't allow us to bifurcate between modernism and liberalism and the end of the supernatural, and also education and knowledge and the biblical tradition. Pentecostalism shows us that people still need to have transcendence and to also have the supernatural among us. And I think because, and particularly places like Africa and many parts of the world, did not go through the Enlightenment like many of the Western world. And so, of course, when you see colonial Christianity crashing in many cases, it was actually the Pentecostal, whether it's the African traditional religion and African independent churches and Pentecostal churches, that brought in a worldview that kept intact the supernatural and the biblical tradition. And this is why things like small groups and worship songs, and that people want to feel, they want to be caught up. They don't just want a cold, insipid religion that is just formalized into text, but they want the numinous, they want the transcendence. And Pentecostalism gives us that without taking us back into an ancient tradition. It gives us a modernized way to have music and to have the prophetic word and to have preaching, to celebrate Christ in a way that we don't have to kiss our brains goodbye. At the same time, we don't have to kiss the supernatural goodbye. It can keep the both together. And it's because of this, while we are seeing an explosion of Pentecostalism, the burgeoning of Pentecostalism around the world, that we want to ensure that the Pentecostal tradition. And lastly, in this point, I'm so pleased that not just Black Pentecostal theology, but Pentecostal theology is giving us some of the great insights. When I think about people like Amos Young and Verlin Matty Carcane, and I think about David Daniels, I think about Estrella Alexandria, I think about many others who are showing us the academic aspect that Pentecostalism is contributing towards the theological tradition. And I think it's so rich and it's so on time. And I'm so excited to be a part of it.
Yes, indeed. I have consulted Dr. Amos Young and others' work and learned much from them. You are also a coach and a strategist for global leadership. Can you share with us some of the challenges that Christian leaders face when they want to become global leaders?
Oh, yes. I think, first of all, we have to understand what I would call cultural narrowness versus cultural intelligence. Many Christian leaders are shaped by local theology, local theological and cultural assumptions that don't always translate globally. And to lead effectively across borders, they must develop a sort of a cultural intelligence, or CQ if you want, and a theology that transcends nationalism. And so it's important, and that's not always easy when you have a dominant Western tradition and you're part of it, this cultural narrowness. And I think another challenge is the colonial legacy that still plagues us, that Christian global leaders cannot ignore the historic and the lingering effects of colonial missions. Leaders must navigate this legacy with humility as they engage diverse contexts without replicating patterns of domination. In addition to that, I think contextual theology and relevance is a challenge because global leaders demand the ability to make theology contextually relevant, incarnating the gospel in a way that respects indigenous expressions without compromising core truth. That is such a challenge as a missionary person who worked in Ghana and other parts of the world, dealing with cultural expression and biblical truths and without compromising core truth is a theological dance. I think another area that I would say is a challenge for me as a global leader is the issue of language translation and communication barriers. Effective global leaders, I believe, and global leadership requires a clarity across linguistic and cultural divides. And what I mean by that, I think Christian leaders must learn to communicate in a way that are not just translated, but truly translatable in meaning and in intent. And I think Lamin Sana and many others taught us about the importance of the translatability. Christianity, as Lamin Sana taught us missiologically, is a translatable religion. And that makes it to be globalized. I think also the identity formation in a post-truth world is a challenge for us. Leaders must help people form identity rooted in Christ in a world shaped by globalization, digital cultures, a world shaped by what David Bosch called the de-absolutization of truth. And this can be especially complex in diasporic and multicultural settings. And I could go on in terms of leadership models, Western versus global South. These are difficult terrains to navigate. Many leadership frameworks taught in seminaries and leadership courses are Western in origin. Leaders must learn some of those models to embrace leadership styles that are more communal, narrative-based, spiritually integrated, as often we've seen in the global South. And so many people who are formed in the Western tradition need to be careful about how they express that. And lastly, I would say sustainability, the demand of global leadership can lead to burnout. Without rhythm of the Sabbath, solitude, and community, even the most gifted leader will risk their center losing their center. And I think, as Howard Thurman reminds us, don't ask what the world needs, ask what you can come. Ask what makes you come alive. Soul care is missional and critical. Let me just mention one more thing. I think representation and equality in leadership tables is important. Many global leaders platforms remain gatekeepers by dominant cultural traditions. And I think it's important that we allow people from different traditions to also be a part of the table. Leaders from the margins most often fight for visibility and voice, even in spaces that preach equality. And as a person who's been trained in the Western tradition, although much of my training was also in Africa, where I was privileged to be taught by people like Kwame Bediako and Lamin Sana and John Mbiti and many others. But still, we must be careful that we don't come with a dominant voice that really overpowers the traditions that we are engaging with. There's a sense of humility that must come when you're coming from America, Europe, when you enter cultures and locations that are developing and do not have long traditions of Christian institutions that we have. So there's a lot there to discuss, but we do need leaders that are global and globally competent. And wherever we go, we teach people to share together, and we bring leaders together to dialogue and so on and so forth. So it's so important that we understand that we are to be globally competent and to be able to speak and preach in a different locations. And lastly, I would say that I'm so blessed to be a part of a multicultural church. We have people from the Philippines, people from the United States, Black, white, Asian, Latino, all together. And I'm so excited each Sunday when hundreds of people gather and we congregate together and we have a wonderful time of worshiping the Lord.
Thank you very much for your work, your wisdom, and your knowledge. And thank you very much for joining the podcast today. If you like the podcast and this episode, please comment and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.